Thinking back to the days when he was a young night administrator at Cook County Hospital in Chicago, John Bluford refers to himself as a human gun collector. This is because he was responsible for collecting contraband that patients and visitors brought into the hospital, including guns, knives, and machetes. As a young man, he also had a job working as an epidemiologist in St. Louis, interviewing community residents about sensitive health topics. These experiences complemented his master's degree training at Northwestern University to groom him to be comfortable as a leader in talking with all kinds of people on all kinds of topics. Mr. Bluford moved to the Twin Cities to become the administrator of the Pilot City Health Center and later worked his way up through the ranks at the Hennepin County Medical Center, also in Minneapolis. He helped found the Metropolitan Health Plan, a health maintenance organization for Medicaid enrollees and others. In the late 90s, he was recruited to become president and CEO of Truman Medical Centers in Kansas City, Missouri. Truman Medical Centers was in need of change, and Mr. Bluford was able to bring about a turnaround. Among the changes were an emphasis on making the facility more attractive through basic cleanliness and the display of a large art collection. He partnered with a bank to offer financial services at the hospital and sponsored a farmer's market. While he was there, the hospital established a corporate academy to help further the lifelong learning of employees. In an oral history interview about his life and career, Mr. Bluford reminisced about lessons learned in each step along his career path. He shared thoughts on leadership style and governance. He also shared information about his current passion, the Bluford Healthcare Leadership Institute. These are selections from the oral history conducted in 2016.
You mentioned how difficult it was in Nashville during the 60s. Well, it was difficult on the west side of Chicago also, and I realize we're talking about a little later period in time. But the west side still is, to some extent, a tough part of town. And there was an interesting House staff strike at Cook County in October 1975. And you were there then.
That is correct.
Could you talk about that a little bit? I don't know if it still stands, but at the time it was the longest doctor's strike in U.S. history.
I believe that is the case. You know, that time is a little fuzzy for me, Kim, but I can tell you this. What I do remember is how nursing stepped up. I have the greatest respect for nurses. I learned how to run a hospital through nurses. They taught me, remember, it's after hours at night. I learned what to do, how to do it, what not to do through nurses in large part. And I do remember them holding that facility up during that period of time. They had to. It's not going to be the faculty positions. And at that point in time, Cook County Hospital was somewhere between a 1,600 bed and 2,000 bed hospital, depending on what you wanted to count. And each department, you talk about the Department of Pediatrics, the Department of Medicine, well, they had their own building, separate building. I think there were about 16, 18 buildings on that campus at that time at 1800 West Harrison Avenue in Chicago. So the one thing that I remember I'm a very junior, new administrator there, so I wasn't necessarily in all of the board meetings that discuss what's going on with the residents. I was on the front line. And the thing that I remember most acutely is that nurses stepped up and carried the load during that period of time. You know, I was the human gun collector. I was a human metal detector at Cook County Hospital in their emergency room.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, during the evenings and nights, anytime someone came in with contraband, they'd call the night administrator, and I'd have to talk with that patient or client or guest and say, no, you can't have that here. And oftentimes I would take machetes and pistols and guns to my office and hold them for the patients once they got released from the hospital. So I really developed I was everybody's friend. Here again, I lean back to some of the skills that I learned as an epidemiologist and having tough discussions with folks. And that led me to be very effective in working with tough clients to get their weapons from them. It offered me some insight and skill sets when talking with patients who didn't want blood transfusions and were willing to die as opposed to have a transfer of blood because of religious purposes. And I would talk them out of that. If it took all night, I'd spend all night.
Is that Jehovah's Witnesses?
Jehovah's Witness, yes. And I bet you I had more than a dozen of those types of conversations with Jehovah's Witnesses.
Well, that's interesting, but I'm still sort of caught back on the human gun collector. It surprises me that it wasn't an armed security guard who was given a task like that, or would that have exacerbated the situation?
Yeah, it's different times. I think there was a precinct right there at the hospital. But this is the early 70s and mid 70s, and rules were different. People wanted to carry guns, and you didn't have the signs, no weapons allowed in those times. People bring their weapons in, particularly knives, big knives.
Machete knives.
Exactly.
There were some larger-than-life individuals who worked at Cook County, and I wondered whether you had the opportunity to meet Dr. Quentin Young, for example, or Dr. James Houghton, or, this is not somebody who worked there, but the famous George Dunn.
Yes, I've seen George Dunn because I used to go to the budget meetings, but I knew Dr. Houghton, and I became quite acquainted with Quentin Young. And the story is like this. As an administrative resident, which is how I started at Cook County that first summer, I had to go meet Dr. Houghton. So I go over to his office in a separate building, and I catch the elevator, and lo and behold, who comes onto the elevator but Dr. Houghton. So he's very hard to miss. He's a very tall gentleman. And I knew exactly who he was. And I introduced myself because I was coming to meet with him and introduce myself. And the first thing he says, well, why would you want to get into a business like this? There's no money in it. And I can't remember my response, but I do remember that statement, obviously. And what he was referencing is that it was very public what his salary was. And he was the highest paid government official in the state of Illinois in the early 70s. And his salary was $60,000. But he was running a $100 million operation. Now you think about those numbers in today's terms, those are huge numbers, both of them. But compared to his colleagues in industry running a $100 million business, a $60,000 salary didn't foot. And when he said that, I just kind of smiled to myself because I'm saying, hey, if I could make $60,000, I'm good to go. So I did have a distant relationship with him after that meeting. But the funniest story, which is just Cook County history, I was assigned to go put a padlock on Dr. Quentin Young's office door one night because Dr. Houghton and Dr. Young did not get along. And some of the physician strike, the resident strike, in fact, was driven by Quentin Young. And I had to go put a lock on his door. It's just putting a lock on the door in the middle of the night. But I played a role in the ultimate conflict and ouster of Dr. Young from the staff for a short period of time. Of course, he's gone on and had a tremendous impact in public health and otherwise, but I did recognize him. You know, the medicine department at Cook County Hospital at that time was 400 and 450 beds, something like that. It was a hospital in itself. And with the residents and the volume of patients, there was always constant gamesmanship on how many beds were available for admissions. And that's what created some of the strife with the residents striking. Too much workload.
Do you have anything else that you would like to say about your time at Cook County?
The only thing I can say, Kim, is that I loved working at Cook County Hospital, and it was not unusual for me to spend a 16-hour day at Cook. It was single, young, lots of energy, and a thirst to learn, and that was the place to do it. So my regular paid hours were typically, let's just say, from 12 midnight to 6 or 8 in the morning, whatever 8-hour shift was then. And then I'd stay during the day because that's where you really learn from the pros who are running the hospital. And I'd go to the business meetings and so forth and so on. Run home, get a little nap, come back, start all over again. I used to love seeing the hospital wake up in the morning. You know, from the night experience to that 6 and 7 o'clock in the morning when new fresh staff are coming out. That was just a beautiful sight to me. I still like that. And oftentimes over the course of my career, whether it's at Hennepin or at Truman, I'm always in the office at 5:30, 6 o'clock because I like seeing the institution wake up.
And I think it's worth noting, we've said some somewhat negative things about Cook County, or at least talked about the challenges that Cook County faced and still faces today. But we should say also in a positive light that it's regarded nationwide, at least perhaps worldwide, as just a wonderful place to learn medicine.
Yeah, it's a great training ground.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And of course, it is a safety net hospital. And I think you have terms that you prefer other than safety net, but the concept of being there for people who don't have any place else to go.
Exactly.
Yeah. We're going to talk about another significant career move. You left Minneapolis after spending a couple of decades there and moved to Kansas City. Could you tell about, let's see, what would be a good starting point? The place that you went is such an interesting place. It was formerly the Kansas City General Hospital, at least in part.
As was Hennepin County. It was Hennepin County General Hospital as well, many years before I got there.
But Hennepin County was not a segregated hospital, which, right? Wouldn't have been, no.
Not in Hubert Humphrey's town. That's right.
Good point.
But de facto, probably.
Interesting.
Just because it was for the indigent and the poor. I
hadn't thought about the concept of de facto segregation.
Yeah. I mean, you know, people of means would be going to the University of Minnesota or Fairview Hospital System or Northwestern Hospital System, not Hennepin County General Hospital. But we changed that primarily, and it's a concept that I'll talk a little bit more about at Truman, but really by increasing its quality quotient and improving its aesthetics in its environment. And I'm a big one in that. You know, you are what you look like. And much of the benefit that I brought to the institution was rehabbing the environment to make it more conducive and amenable and aesthetically appealing to a broader patient base. And, you know, one of my favorite sayings, Kim, is that poor people don't like going to a poor person's hospital. And I was always very conscious of making my clientele feel appreciated and have the same kind of amenities that any other hospital would have. So the combination of just the aesthetics and the influx of major cutting edge technology like the Siemens program really brought our institution into the mainstream of the delivery system of the Twin Cities. We spent, hundreds of millions of dollars in improving the environment. And that's paid off by diversifying the payer mix that institution attracted. So Truman Medical Centers calls me, and a headhunter, and asks would I be interested in taking a look at that opportunity. For many, many years, there's a gentleman by the name of Jim Mongan, who was the CEO and dean of the medical school at Truman. Tremendous individual in the field, ultimately went up and ran Partners in Boston and Mass General and so forth. Dr. Mongan knew of me. Why? Because he asked me to come down to Kansas City years before to teach them how to set up an HMO. Just like Grady, just like Boston City Hospital, just like Denver General. And so he was, one, familiar with me in that role as a consultant for him during those days. And then secondly, the reputation that Hennepin County Medical Center had achieved, in part during my tenure. Now, Hennepin County Medical Center had great reputation long before I got there, particularly in some of the clinical areas and kidney disease, for example, and their relationship with the University of Minnesota. I think my contribution to that environment was that I opened it up to a broader patient base, and it was seen not only as an institution for the poor, but an institution for people who were sick. So this headhunter calls me, and during that point in my career, I was 48 or 49 years old, which is kind of prime time for people in this business, because your next employer is saying, well, he's at the top of his game, still has energy, he's got wisdom, and he can be with us for 10 years. So it's getting a lot of calls from all over the country, particularly to come and do turnarounds at safety net environments. Grady, Detroit Medical, to name two. And my response to all of these inquiries was always, okay, fine, I'll talk with you, but you got to come to Minneapolis and meet me in my office. And people did that on Sunday mornings. Remember that theme about working on Sunday mornings? So the headhunter would come and we'd go through the typical interview process. And then I would take them on a walk around our hospital. And I'd say, if I were to choose to come there, is this something that Truman Medical Center might want to be like? And of course, the answer is always going to be yes, because I was very familiar with all of the major safety net hospitals around the country, and I knew where we stood. And it's always been in the top rung, the top 2 or 3. So the gentleman came, and the next thing I know that I'm on my way to Kansas City for an interview. Interesting process, Kim. A lot of people in the interview, the entire board, and the subcommittee, the nominating committee, and then they brought in folks from the community. I mean, it was pretty awesome. And that institution was going through tremendous problems, a lot of problems. They had some union issues. They just fired a CEO, Dr. Anderson, for a variety of reasons, and he sued them. He, previous to them letting him go, had fired some chairs of clinical departments, most notably the chair of medicine and the chair of radiology. And the medical staff sued him. And then he sued the medical school. I mean, there was a lot of action going on. And as a backdrop, the federal government was suing the hospital for Medicaid fraud. So, and the morale of the hospital was at an all-time low. And the facility was not up to speed. And I came down and toured that facility and heard of all the problems and got real excited. Because basically I said, you can't mess this up. It's got to go up. And I was very serious about that. That's number one. And number two, there was clearly a great desire and interest on the part of the community at large to see that Truman Medical Center be successful. That was very important. And three, there was a very big need, a necessity for Truman to be successful for that community. And each of those things were very appealing to me. And I did two things that were critically important. The first thing is that I insisted that I come to a full board meeting prior to me being given the offer. I knew they were going to offer me the position. I was the candidate of choice. The headhunter had shared that with me. But I insisted that I come to a full board meeting before they hired me. And before I did that, Kim, I did a lot of research on Truman. And I did some secret shopper stuff on my own, coming in at night. I'm very accustomed to being in hospitals at night and visiting and talking with people before they knew who I was. And I realized a lot of deficits that board members would not typically know about. And I just started with the medical records department. It was a disaster. It was a joke. And anybody in our business knows that if you don't have a strong medical record department, you can't bill for services, and your quality is not that good either. And I shared those kinds of stories with the board when I asked if I could have a few words with them before their decision. And I was very bold because I thought that was necessary. And essentially, I said two things. First and foremost, if you hire me, there will be change. Might be good, might be bad, don't know, will be change. That's my track record. And number two is that I have to have 100% cooperation with you, this board, in terms of who's running the ship. And if there are any issues, whether it be in housekeeping or food service or clinical services that you are aware of, that call comes to me, not to the chair of the department, not to the union steward or whomever else. It comes to me, and if I don't fix it, I'm the problem, not those respective department heads. And a couple of people swallowed on that because they didn't really, they're saying, now, who is this guy? And yada, yada, yada. And they bought that. So that was step one. So I've got a mandate to change now. And then the second critical aspect of my accepting the position is I went back to Hennepin and I went to 5 or 6 of my key C-suite partners and said, how would you like to go to Kansas City? And 5 of the 6 had never been to Kansas City. And they all said yes. And then I mandated that they come down and spend the weekend before they made the decision. And they did. And the most telling aspect of those conversations with my staff that ultimately followed with me was that this is not a job, this is a mission. And everybody bought into that. And the second aspect of that, and there were 6 of them that came, 5 initially and then a chief information officer later, is that I expect everyone to have home ownership within 90 days of coming to Kansas City. So that was a message to the 3,000 people who worked at that hospital and the community at large that we're going to be here. And we're going to be here for the long haul to make a difference. And it's just been a tremendous experience with a very contentious board. And, you know, I kind of honed my board skills with an elected body in Hennepin County. This is a 501c3. It's not a public hospital anymore. When they went from the general hospital to Truman Medical Center, it was a 501c3 that has county funding and city funding, but has its own independent, self-perpetuating board. And at the time that I went to Kansas City, that board numbered 51 people. 51, 54, who's counting? A lot. And my famous comment upon first meeting them is that this is not a board, this is a zip code. There's a lot of people in this room. And we ultimately got that board number down to 31, 34 people, something like that. But it's a representational board. So the mayor of the city appoints X number of people, the county executive submits a certain number of people on the board. The medical staff had membership. 2 employees were on it. The medical school had membership. So, and then you've got to have non-involved people to balance that out. So you get 30 people real quick that way. But it's all worked out because they were all committed and on the same page. And I think that's where some of those point guard skills came into play in terms of massaging egos and bringing people into one tent for a common goal. So there were, Kim, like 3 simple objectives that I had for that institution on day one. The first one is that it's going to be a clean environment. And then secondly, ultimately aesthetically pleasing environment. And third, it's going to be a quality environment in any and everything we do. And Kathy and I and the rest of the team spent the first 2 months trying to talk to 3,000 employees to find out what their issues were and what their vision for the institution was. And 2 months later, we came back in big town hall meetings and say, okay, this is what we heard from you. This is what we have in mind. And this is what we're going to do. And that quality issue, the aesthetically pleasing environment issue. And we later added technology as a strategic asset. And those things, quite frankly, I think in an institution that had 30 to 35% bad debt rate because of the uncompensated care burden, which is grossly disproportionate in that community, we were still able to, build $500 million worth of infrastructure in that institution, starting with Siemens, by the way, and made a significant difference in that community. The other thing that we were able to achieve and implement is what I shared with the rest of the field during my investiture, and that is thinking outside of the bed. And I think we were a little bit ahead on the front end of the notion that hospitals need to redefine themselves and can't be contained within the 4 walls of the facility. So we had a number of community outreach programs that to this day are still thriving and doing very well, which I'm very appreciative of. One of them, which leads to my second area of interest, and that is social economic determinants of health, was the notion that we negotiated a relationship with U.S. Bank to come in and open up a full-service branch within our building. And that was significant for a number of reasons. Number one, in the urban core environment, there are not a lot of banks. Number two, the necessity for that was because many of our employees didn't have checking accounts, and I wanted direct deposit on their pay stubs. And there was all kind of pushback because either they didn't have it, or they didn't want it, checking account, or they couldn't get it for a variety of reasons. And many of our employees use the cash stores to conduct every day of life. And I had an undergraduate student of mine do a study on that, and we realized that many of our employees were paying $1,200, $1,500 a year in fees just to pay their water bills and their rental and their car notes because they didn't have checking accounts. And for entry-level positions, $1,200, $1,500 a year is more than their cost of living increase next year. It's just phenomenal to me. So we convinced U.S. Bank to come in, and they were required to offer any and everybody a checking account. That thing has just blossomed into one of the best things we've ever done. $3 million plus in loans a year or so ago to employees, over $3 million in deposits, and the community at large now comes in the Truman Medical Center just to use the bank. So that's just one example of how healthcare and hospitals, because they're such valuable resources in their communities, can make a difference in the everyday lives of their constituents. And we're real proud of that. We did a number of things like that. The farmers market gets a lot of play. We were doing clinics and educational sessions in the libraries. That's why you saw the picture of my son and Guy in Bluford in the library, because we have sessions for senior citizens in the libraries. We did school-based clinics, which is not necessarily a new opportunity, but we did a lot of them. We had about 50 billboards throughout the urban core that used to be used for cigarettes and beer commercials, and we just had very positive statements about the health, not crass advertisement. It was the small Truman Medical Center, but it just made the community feel better about itself. We did this art museum in a hospital, or hospital in an art museum. That was just fascinating. I think that hospital has a collection well over $1 million now. It's just it's beautiful. We had people from the community who would never thought setting foot in Truman Medical Centers come just to take a tour of the art, with national exhibits from Fisk University and other places. People like Richard Umdenstock and others who've been in hundreds of hospitals have always complimented the presentation of that environment. And what's significant to me about it is that it really is about showing respect for the people you serve. And those patients come in and see that kind of environment, and many of them have asked, well, who is this for? Well, it's for you. And that's got to help the psychology of your health. So I'm very pleased to have, and as you can see, I get excited about that. And there are more programs than I can think of. The Corporate Academy, oh, how could I forget that? I mean, we decided to be an institution of learning and brought in many of the local universities to come in and teach courses on site. So we had employees getting high school diplomas, college degrees, master's degrees, GED preparation courses. Just phenomenal. And I'll never forget a 50-year-old veteran employee of our institution, white male. This is significant because when we set up this program, we thought we would be working with entry-level positions and a lot of young minority employees. This happened to be a very 50-year-old white gentleman who got up in a public meeting to disclaim that he just read a birthday card for his granddaughter, first time ever, because he couldn't read. So I think that those kind of programs mean as much as anything in terms of clinical intervention, in terms of the health of a community. It really speaks to population health. And I think we were a forefront of that, and the intermingling of public health and acute care services.
As preparation for this interview, of course, I looked at some of the things that you've written or that other people have written about you. And you've been quoted as saying that you're proud of, quote, helping to change the culture of the organizations that you've led, helping them to become more competitive, customer service oriented, and innovative. And how do you go about changing the culture of an organization?
Well, one is by example and walking the talk and believing what you're trying to convince others to buy into. And I always perceived my institutions as valuable community resources and assets. And I spent a lot of time educating the broader community on what that meant. A lot of people think in terms of quote unquote general hospitals as being places of the poor. And they're glad to have that so that that constituency can get service, but that's all they see. And there's a term that I frown upon, but it's about serving devalued lives. And that has connotation associated with it. And I've always worked very hard to change that scenario or that viewpoint and have people consider, well, you know, this little building down here, it's a $500 million operation that hires 4,000 people in this community. That's kind of important, don't you think? And, you know, by the way, we spend, you know, $100 million locally on commodities and supplies. And your company might not do so well, Mr. Linen Service, if we didn't buy, you know, $200,000 worth of service from you every year. And I spoke to every business leader, business CEO, one-on-one, every faith-based leader, one-on-one, every elected official, one-on-one, in the first 6 months of my tenure at Truman Medical Centers, bringing them into our four walls and sharing with them our vision and what we needed to do a good job to help them. If we're strong, you'll be stronger, Mr. Banker, because we're going to do our payroll deposits at U.S. Bank. And through that, through the business viewpoint of what hospitals represent in their communities, forward-thinking civic leaders got it and were very instrumental in the turnaround of our hospitals, both Hennepin and Truman. And then the other thing is, you know, you just need a couple of victories for your staff to say, oh, okay, that's us on the front page of that paper about something good we're doing, not somebody getting shot on Saturday night. This is a good thing. And our high watermark was in 2005 when UHC, University Health Consortium, awarded us one of the top 5 academic medical centers in the country. And that was with Chicago Rush, with University of Wisconsin's, with Mass General, and with the Mayo Clinic, and Truman Medical Center. So that's pretty high cotton, as they say down south. and very pleased with that. So can you imagine the collective psychology of that institution when that ranking came out? This is good. This is good. So it kind of motivated us to keep moving forward and become one of the top institutions for IT implementation long before meaningful use. And we did that with our partnership with Cerner. I think one of the strengths that I was able to bring to our environment was the partnership with people like Cerner, people like US Bank, people like Siemens, people like Morrison's Food Service. So we kind of use those entities, people like Walgreens, to co-brand ourselves. So if Walgreens is running the outpatient pharmacy for Truman Medical Centers within our four walls, that's a good thing, because people recognize Walgreens as a quality entity. And if we've got Cerner bringing people to our institution to demonstrate their equipment, that's a good thing, because people look at Cerner in our field as being very prominent in the IT space. Morrison's, if you would go to our cafeteria at Truman Medical Centers, the food's better than most of the restaurants in town. It's delicious because the president of Morrison's came in before we cut the deal and said, whatever it costs to have a quality product, that's what we want. And they did it. So it's always been quality first, and hence the transition or transformation from safety net, with those connotations of devalued lives, to quality net, which is to say, if you're sick, it's not a bad place to be, because you're going to get a quality experience. And that's what I've tried to do for 40 years. And in many instances, we're able to achieve certain milestones in that regard.
It's a powerful message and mission.
It's all about mission.
Is there anything else that you'd like to say about Truman before we wrap up?
Great community support. Once the community recognized that there was reasonable vision, and then continuity of the staff. And many of those people that I bought stayed with us for the duration of my tenure there. And another gentleman that is critical to the positive aspects of Truman was Dr. Mark Steele, who's the chief medical officer, and now is the chief COO. But it's very interesting, that institution had never had a medical director, ever. The reason for that is that the CEO of that environment was always an MD. They just let him do both. And when I got there, I needed a medical director. And I called upon Dr. Steele, who was the chair of emergency medicine, to fill that role. And that's one of the best decisions that I made. And I think he and his colleagues were as much a part of the partnership as anybody else. And the fact of the matter is, you can't get it done without the buy-in of the medical staff. And then the other attribute I think that I bring to the table is you can't get it done without the other 4,000 employees either. So I've always paid a lot of attention and spent a lot of time in getting to know and understand the trials and tribulations of entry-level positions in the institution, because that nursing clerk is the person that the patient sees. And if she doesn't buy into all these fancy plans, it ain't gonna happen. So I tried to pride myself in knowing all of my employees' names, and that's virtually impossible, but I tried. But one thing for sure, everybody knew who I was, and they knew me, and wouldn't have any difficulty in having a conversation with me. So I always have had an open door policy which I subscribe to. One of the first things I did as Truman is put windows in all of the office doors so people could see in and see out. And be transparent, you got to walk the talk.
There are two things I want to ask about just as follow-up, and then we can move on to a different topic.
Okay.
One is, I've been thinking for the past half an hour or so about those 5 or 6 individuals who accompanied you in the transition from Hennepin County to Truman, and wondered how Hennepin County fared after all those seasoned execs left.
Yeah, I wasn't a very popular guy at Hennepin shortly thereafter, and they've had some transitioning. I think it's very stable right now with Dr. Pryor there, who seems to have a good handle. But it's hard for anybody to come in. I'd been at Hennepin for 20 years, and that institution had made major strides. And like I say, it's hard to follow John Wooden if you want to be a basketball coach at UCLA. You don't want to go to a team that's been in the championship game for the last 10 years. It's hard to replicate. And of course, with all the public health policy and the changes in Medicaid and Medicare, those institutions who serve large numbers of those people are going to have problems. They do.
The other thing I was wondering about, you mentioned how you valued the concept of an open door policy, and we often hear executives talk about an open door policy, but what does that actually mean?
That means if you want to see the CEO of this institution, you pick up the phone, you call the secretary and say, I want to see John Bluford. And you show up, or just show up, or you don't have to make that call because, 6 o'clock in the morning, I'm walking through the halls, management by walking around all the time.
And there's another important...
To the chagrin of a lot of my staff, and I never wear a name tag either.
Oh. I think there's another point, and that is that employees need to know that there will be no negative consequences for having spoken to the exec.
Right. Sure. Right. Yeah. That's part of the culture. Yeah, because middle management has to buy into that too.
Okay. I think that this would be a good time to make any additional comments that you'd like to about the Bluford Healthcare Leadership Institute.
The Bluford Healthcare Leadership Institute is now entering its 5th year. I've had 53 scholars come through our program. Those scholars are recruited from historically black colleges and universities primarily, and the University of Missouri, Kansas City. They come with a minimum of 3.0 grade point average. Many of them are 4.0s. They come with a track record of leadership, either as in their student government or as freshmen or captain of the team. I interview all of the candidates for the Institute personally. I go to their campuses. I just had 80 applications for 14 slots. Bring them to Kansas City, and they are exposed to leaders in the field. It's both didactic and experimental. They take tours of various institutions, including art museums and performing arts centers and baseball teams. Those students, if they want to continue, and all of them have, are placed in a position in the field around the country, from Henry Ford Hospital to Duke University to Integris to Kentucky One, health departments, behavioral health departments, Christus Health System in Texas, Blue Cross Blue Shield, America's Essential Hospitals, working with Bruce Siegel. Sent a student out to Denver to work with CHI, Catholic Health Initiatives, and Kevin Lofton. Carmela Coyle at Maryland Hospital Association took a student. In other words, these students are getting first class front exposure to C-suite environments. And the idea is that if they can see it, they can be it. And the longer game plan is to create a pipeline of diverse talent that will significantly impact healthcare disparities among vulnerable patient populations 20 years from now. End of story. Great experiences. I've got 18 young people now in the field or getting advanced degrees. The rest are still, they haven't graduated from undergrad because I pursue them as freshmen and sophomores. So I've got 2 or 3 years to guide and perhaps persuade them to go into the business. These are talented students. They're going to be successful somewhere. The question is, can we bring them to our industry? Which was a major decision that I made on day one in terms of bringing students and trying to bring them up to speed, or getting very talented students and getting them a head start and a push in the field. And we chose the latter. So that has been, it is my passion today. The genesis of it is twofold. One, I've been a preceptor for several graduate programs over the last 25 years, and fellowships and interns with graduate students primarily. And in 1997, I went to the Hennepin County Board and asked if I could establish a formal relationship with Morehouse College to bring undergraduate students to Hennepin County Medical Center and work for the summers. And the idea, the problem is that I never got minority students from the graduate schools because they weren't there. So I went to undergraduates to get them to the graduate schools, to get them into the system. That's one genesis of what I'm doing now. And I really like working with young people because you get as much out of it as they get from you.
It always impresses me when I interview eminent CEOs that they do so much. Beside their principal job, there's all kinds of board service. And
yeah.
It seems to me part of the package. I mean, that's part of being a prominent leader in a community, is you serve on boards.
Yeah.
And then subsequent into retirement, of course.
Right.
But I wonder, I think this would be a good segue into thinking about how you managed work-life balance, and perhaps now would be a really good opportunity to speak of your wife and how she's contributed to everything.
Let me start from one very important element. And you were talking about what I would consider extracurricular activities outside of the walls of the hospital, and serving in a leadership role. And I was very fortunate. I had a gentleman a few years older than I in Minneapolis who suggested to me early in my stay in the Twin Cities that I join the United Way board. And he wanted to put my name in nomination for United Way board. And I'm thinking, United Way board, why would I want to do that? And, I make my $100 contribution every year. He says, no, you ought to really try it. It's really meaningful. You really get to know the community because of all of the agencies, and they probably put you on a committee that has to evaluate the Boy Scouts and the YMCA or this or that, or on allocations, and you really get in the loop, then yada, yada, yada. So I reluctantly did that. And you know what, Cam, I go to the first meeting, and United Way boards are big. And I'm looking around the table. Oh, there's the CEO of Honeywell. Oh, CEO of General Mills. Oh, CEO of 3M. Target, Dayton Hudson Department Store. I said, oh, okay, I get it. Now I get it. So that just puts you in a whole different level of company. In addition to the work of the United Way. So in terms of networking, it was really hard to beat. And as a new young person to the community, it really gave me a jump start of familiarity with different people and them with me. So I just thought I'd raise that. And when I went to Kansas City, what's the first thing? And several people asked, would you get on this board or that board? I specifically asked for the United Way for that reason.